Greetings, and welcome back to the Record of Arms. I'm your host, Mark Seven, and I'm glad to have you here today for part 12 of my series on the wartime career of the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. Last time we finished up our account of the SBD's operations in the Southwest Pacific area from Guadalcanal up the Solomon Sea through to Rabaul and the Bismarcks in Hollandia on New Guinea. We'll now continue with an account of an operation which links this campaign with the other major theater in which the Dauntless flew against the Japanese, the Central Pacific. After this episode, we'll go back in time a bit and begin our look at this parallel drive towards the heart of the Empire. As always, the sources used in the preparation of this episode can be found in the description, along with a link to my Patreon, if you'd like to drop $1 or $2 and help support the show. That said, let's now get back into the story. After the raids on Rabaul, the last major Japanese air and naval units left in the Bismarcks were withdrawn to bases further back, where they'd be less exposed to attack by Allied planes. The most important for our purposes was the fleet base at Truk Atoll, about 700 nautical miles or 1,300 kilometers to the north-northeast. More properly known as Truk Atoll, is today the capital of the Federated States of Micronesia. Located towards the western end of the Caroline Islands, it had been a German possession before the First World War, and was occupied by the Japanese after their entry into that conflict on the Allied side. After the war, Japanese possession was legally confirmed by a grant of a mandate from the League of Nations. In the interwar years, the Japanese had built an extensive and heavily fortified fleet base here, which acquired a formidable reputation, sometimes being called the Gibraltar of the Pacific or alternatively the Japanese Pearl Harbor. Its physical characteristics suited it for the marshalling of large forces of heavy ships, and during the first 2 years of the war was one of the principal bases of the Japanese fleet. From here, Japanese air and naval units could be directed against the Allies in the Southwest Pacific fronts of the Solomons and New Guinea, or towards Central Pacific island groups like the Marshalls, Marianas, and the Gilberts. Like the atolls found further east, Truk was bordered by more or less distorted circular reef dotted with many islands and shoals. This had a perimeter of more than 140 miles, or 225 kilometers, with 41 individual islands strung out along its length. The lagoon enclosed by this ring of islands was about 25 miles or 40 kilometers wide, with a total area of more than 36 square miles or 90 square kilometers, meaning it was large enough that even long-range naval gunfire from ships outside the reef could not reach ships inside. Another 57 islands lay within the lagoon, including 11 of considerable size. These islands, which were rocky, forested, and rose to considerable heights, presented a strong contrast with the low-lying, flat, and featureless sand islands that made up the atolls of the groups further east. The Big Islands were located near the center of the lagoon. In the speech of the native peoples, Truk means mountain, and with the highest point reaching to 1,453 feet or 443 meters, the atoll certainly qualifies as mountainous in terms of the Central Pacific theater. The Japanese base complex included 4 airstrips, a seaplane base, and repair and logistical facilities employing 3,000 or 4,000 naval personnel. Strong fixed defenses were manned by about 7,500 soldiers and included 40 large-caliber anti-aircraft guns. It was intended to equip these with a radar fire control system, but this had been lost aboard a vessel torpedoed en route by an American submarine. Between 300 and 400 aircraft were usually based on the atoll's airfields, though the number on any given day could vary widely, as aviation units were often shifted to and from this base to others. At the time of the strike, there were known to be 161 operational planes on the 4 islands of Aten, Tillman, Moen, and Param, with another 180 unserviceable and awaiting repair on Aten. On the 4th of February 1944, a pair of long-range Liberator photographic reconnaissance planes flying out of Bougainville carried out a mission to Truk. There they found a significant portion of the Japanese combined fleet lying at anchor. Though cloud cover obscured part of the scene, at least one battleship, thought to be the massive super dreadnought Musashi, 2 carriers and half a dozen heavy cruisers were found there, along with dozens of transports, auxiliaries, repair ships, and numerous smaller vessels. This set in motion the preparation of a multi-day air assault from the newly augmented American carrier force, codenamed Operation Hailstone. The attack was timed to coincide with Operation Catchpole, the landings at Eniwetok, the last major assault in the Marshalls Group. Truk was almost equidistant from Eniwetok and Rabaul, and the ships in the harbor could constitute a threat to the Catchpole landings. Hailstone attack would aim to eliminate the threat of intervention there by Truk-based sea and air forces. Strike was to be carried out by the carrier air groups of Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58. The Essex-class ships Essex, Intrepid, Bunker Hill, and Yorktown, namesake of the carrier sunk at Midway, along with the veteran Enterprise CV-6, formed the core of this task force. This was supplemented by the Independence-class light cruisers Belleau Wood, Cabot, Monterey, and Cowpens. Surface escort was provided by a battle group, 6 new fast battleships, 10 cruisers, and a numerous screen of destroyers. The Essex-class fleet carriers were the first such ships to enter service with the United States Navy since the beginning of the war. Their design was completed before the outbreak of war in Europe. A larger carrier was wanted in view of the decision of most of the naval powers to cease abiding by the Washington Naval Treaty, which limited the tonnage and the number of each fleet's major units. The Essex-class design was free of the treaty restrictions imposed on the Wasp, the Ranger, and the Yorktown-class vessels. They were larger than any other existing American carrier type except for the Saratoga and Lexington, both of which had been converted from large battlecruiser hulls as a result of the treaty provisions. Displacing 27,000 tons standard and measuring more than 850 feet long, the Essexes were fast, capable of 33 knots. This power was provided by geared turbines developing more than 150,000 shaft horsepower, fed by 8 Babcock and Wilson boilers, driving 4 shafts. Some later Essex-class ships were completed with a lengthened bow section, and these long-hull Essexes are sometimes called the Ticonderoga class. Anti-aircraft armament consisted of a dozen 5-inch 38 caliber guns and 4 twin and 4 single mounts, as well as automatic weapons in the form of 32 Bofors 40mm weapons and 55 Oerlikon 20mm automatic cannon. These were assisted by search and fire control radars. The number of anti-aircraft weapons and fire control devices multiplied as the war went on. Flight decks continued to be unarmored, but the hangar deck was armored. This offered most of the protection of the armored flight decks used on the British carriers, with the advantage of locating the armor's weight lower in the ship's structure, thus aiding stability. The principal value of the fleet carrier lay in its air group, and the Essexes were better suited than their predecessors to the operation of the larger, heavier, and faster aircraft that were coming into shipboard use. Features that made aviation operations faster and easier were the inclusion of a side deck elevator, like that used on the Wasp, which lowered and raised aircraft between hangar and flight deck without the need for a large hole in the flight deck or an elevator well taking up space on the hangar deck. The side elevator could also be used to increase deck parking space when locked in the up position. 2 catapults were also installed in the flight deck, which greatly increased the speed of launch given the need of most of the larger planes in the fleet's inventory for catapult launch. A hangar deck catapult was originally part of the design, reminiscent of those used in the multi-deck carriers of the early 30s, although this was removed in refits early on. Altogether, the striking force carried 569 aircraft, 275 of which were F-6F Hellcat fighters. It was this large fighter complement that gave Task Force 58 the ability to contest the air against a potentially large force of land-based aircraft. The capability of a purely shipborne air force to successfully achieve air superiority against such a defense was a new thing, and was the basis for the so-called hit-and-stay tactics Mitcher's force employed. In contrast to earlier hit-and-run raids, this meant that the carriers could mount multiple strikes over multiple days, thoroughly devastating the enemy objective. This task would be carried out by the 300 bombers carried by the fleet, about half of which were dive bombers and the other half their usual partners, the Avenger-equipped torpedo squadron. In early 1944, the time of the greatest deployment of SBDs outside the continental U.S. was approaching. Perhaps ironically, at this time the type was also being phased out of first-line carrier service, as newer types began to come off the assembly lines in sufficient quantities. At the time of Hailstone, this process hadn't gone very far yet. About 150 SBDs were aboard Task Force 58's carriers. With the exception of the Bunker Hill, on which VB-17 was equipped with the newer Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, all of Task Force 58's dive bomber squadrons flew the Dauntless. This included those embarked on the light carriers, where their non-folding wings created handling difficulties in the restricted space of their hangar decks. Squadrons aboard the fleet carriers were Enterprise's VB-10, Yorktown's VB-5, Intrepid's VB-6, and Essex's VB-9. The carrier force, divided into 3 task groups, departed for Truk from Rabaul Atoll, recently captured during the Marshall Islands campaigns, arriving at a launch point about 90 miles or 145 kilometers from the atoll in the pre-dawn hours of the 16th of February. As is common in accounts of Central Pacific actions, the dates involved sometimes vary by 1 day more or less according to the source. This is due to the different reporting conventions of various sources. Thus, the Hailstone strikes are sometimes reported as beginning on the 16th and sometimes on the 17th. In this account, I'll be using the date of February 16th as the initial day of the attack, so this is consistent with the first-hand accounts I'm going to quote. However, it should be noted that most sources state that the operation took place on the 17th, 18th. In any case, Admiral Minnie Ichikoga, in command of the Japanese fleet units based there, had deduced the probability of a Rabaul-style assault with heavy ships with the before-mentioned Liberator reconnaissance flight over the atoll. He had, in consequence, withdrawn his heavy ships to bases further westwards by the 10th, most heading for Palau and some, like the Musashi, all the way back to the home islands. As the Americans approached, only 3 light cruisers and 8 destroyers remained in the lagoon or in the immediate vicinity, along with some smaller combatants and patrol vessels. A large assortment of auxiliaries and merchant ships were also present. Although the absence of Koga's big ships meant that the threat to the Eniwetok landings had disappeared, the Americans nonetheless prepared a series of heavy attacks on the fleet base. The assault opened with a daybreak fighter sweep targeting Japanese air defense. This was carried out by 72 Hellcats that came in at low level. This opening move had been used before by Mitcher's carrier air groups during the Marshall campaigns. It exploited a known weakness of Japanese air search radar, which could not detect low-flying planes at any useful distance. Further, the Japanese had just stood their fighters down from high alert after having spent almost 2 weeks that way after the appearance of the Liberator reconnaissance planes on the 4th. The Hellcats therefore achieved almost total surprise, and though something like 30 Japanese fighters were in the air, they made no coordinated attempt to tackle the American raiders. 30 to 50 more, mostly A6M0 fighters plus 1 or 2 of the floatplane version, the Nakajima A6M2N, known by the reporting name Roof, were able to get airborne during this raid. The Hellcats mauled them, shooting down about 30 of the defenders for a loss of 4 of their own. Other Hellcats shot up the planes parked on the airfields, though many of these were unserviceable to begin with. Radar, anti-aircraft, and shipping were also shot up by the marauding fighters. When they departed, fewer than 100 operable Japanese planes were left at Truk. Though small numbers of fighters would contest the following raids, they would prove unable to make much impression, and resistance in the air was negligible by the afternoon. Bombers began leaving the carriers at 0700 hours and were over the target by 0810. Deckload strikes of 2 or 3 dozen planes were flown off by the big carriers, while the Independence-class ships launched smaller raids in rotation. These nearly continuous strikes from the light carriers ensured that the Japanese were constantly engaged somewhere in the atoll. Like the preliminary fighter sweeps in strength, this was another part of the so-called Mitcher treatment, or Mitcher shampoo, that had proven so effective in the Marshalls. In all, more than 30 separate attacks would be carried out against targets in the atoll on the 16th. Enterprise's VB-10's first dive-bombing attack was led by Lieutenant Commander Richard Poore, at the head of 11 SBDs. Their target was shipping in the anchorage at Dublin Island. The Dauntlesses claimed 2 hits on a freighter and near misses on a light cruiser and a tanker. The Japanese ships that were able to got underway, but, like elsewhere in the atoll that morning, most were caught lying at anchor. Ships and shore installations put up a wall of flak, but this failed to stymie the assault. The lead element of the dive bomber formation was led by the future Rear Admiral James D. Ramage, then a lieutenant and the squadron's executive officer. His backseater, Aviation Radioman First Class Dave Cawley, recalls his part in this mission. Quote, "The morning of 16 February was clear, cool, and beautiful as we launched from the Enterprise. We approached from the east, and action started as we were about 12,000 feet, nearly over the center of the lagoon. Our targets were in the anchorage adjacent to Dublin Island. Unlike most of the islands we had seen and attacked, which were low, flat atolls, the Truk Islands were volcanic with quite high peaks. Just before we reached the roll-in, we were in quite heavy AA, diving very close to a steep peak on Dublin. I could see heavy AA coming up from the anchorage and surrounding islands, when whoosh, I saw a horrendous mushroom cloud rising up from the roadstead. Someone had blown up an ammunition ship. The fireball that resulted went up 300 feet. Cawley was correct here. The ammunition ship was the 10,350-ton Ayakoko Maru, and the blast was violent enough to destroy the Avenger, which had dealt the fatal blow. Now we turn to Ramage to continue the account. As I looked over the targets, I picked the biggest ship of a group of about a dozen. She was a tanker at anchor. In answer to my signal, my wingmen, Lieutenant J.G. Bill Schaefer and Lieutenant J.G. Oliver Hubbard, began to fall back. We did not roll in from echelon because we liked to keep our defensive V formation as long as possible. I split my dive flaps and set my pipper on a position just forward of the ship's bridge. I manually released my 1,000-pound GP bomb at 2,000 feet, turned left to pull out to see the results. The tanker was covered with smoke and water splashes, and I could not count the hits. One of them, however, had detached the stern from the ship, and she was definitely going down by the stern. The tanker was empty and hence hard to sink. After the dive, the SBDs began their escape run at low level. We now returned to Cawley's account. We dropped low over the water and were taken under fire by a rusty hulk of an old cargo ship or tanker. It was covered with AA and machine guns, and they were all firing at us. We were very close. I strafed it as best I could as we turned north to the open area of the lagoon. Only then did I have a chance to look back at our target and the planes following us. I spotted one of our SBDs about half a mile behind us, still in his vertical dive. At the pull-out point, his dive varied about 10 degrees and he dove almost vertically into the water. I saw more of our planes diving and bombs exploding, and more AA. The ship that Ramage and Cawley hit was in fact not a tanker, but the 5,400-ton Navy cargo ship Seiko Maru. The second section, led by Lou Bangs, came in behind Ramage and landed one amidships on the 4,650-ton seaplane tender Akitsushima. This ship was also misidentified at the time as a light cruiser. One of these second section planes, manned by Ensign Robert Wilson and his gunner H. Honea, were bounced by four of the remaining Japanese fighters as they pulled out of their attack dive and ran from the area. Despite the 4-to-1 odds against them, the Navy men combined maneuver and defensive firepower to successfully make their escape, downing one of their pursuers and driving off another with gunfire before finally losing the remaining pair in Cloudbank. A second strike by VB-10 that afternoon scored hits on the 13,000-ton freighter Hio Maru and the 7,000-ton aviation store ship Kiyozumi Maru, leaving both burning. After their bombing runs, the SBDs strafed a pair of patrol vessels with their 50 calibers, leaving them aflame as well. When their 50 caliber ammunition was exhausted, the SBDs formed a circle around the stricken vessels, while their rear gunners emptied their twin 30 calibers into the ships below. The fact that the SBDs were able to linger in the area and use up all their defensive machine gun ammunition without fear of enemy fighters is another consequence of the air superiority the task force fighter groups were able to achieve. VB-10's third and final mission that day, with 10 dive bombers this time, blasted ammunition and fuel storage on Dublin Island, setting off a massive conflagration that sent a column of dense black smoke up to an observed altitude of 8,000 feet, 2,400 meters, forming a biblical pillar of cloud which the dive bombers left behind them as they made their way back to the Enterprise. As darkness overtook the atoll and the fleet, the battle nonetheless continued. During the night, both sides launched raids using radar-equipped torpedo bombers. Avengers from the task force were launched against shipping in one of the first assaults of this kind. Results were mixed, with hits claimed on about a dozen vessels. The radar the TBFs were using had trouble distinguishing ships from the many small islands in the atoll. One consequence of this night strike was that the Avengers employed were not available for strikes when they were mounted the next morning. The Japanese launched repeated raids by small numbers of B-5N Kate torpedo bombers. These attempts were mostly foiled by a combination of shipboard guns, evasive maneuver, radar-equipped Avengers flying in a night fighter role, and the limitations of the Japanese radar itself. Despite all this, one B-5N put a torpedo into the side of the Intrepid, causing extensive damage and sending her back east for repairs. The next morning, consistent with the hit and stay doctrine, the task force struck the atoll again. Once again, this opened with a daybreak fighter sweep. Few enemy planes survived the first day, so the Hellcat shot up all manner of targets in the lagoon and on the airfields. The first strike from Enterprise consisted of 12 dive bombers with fighter escort. Ramage describes this mission, quote, "I led the strike which circled outside the lagoon until it was light enough to attack remaining shipping within the lagoon. The 1st Division went after an oiler, the 10,000-ton Fujisan Maru, which surprisingly was underway. After 1 to 3 hits, the ship went dead in the water. 2nd Division dived on the auxiliary, the Metsutan Maru, which was also underway, and hit her midships. These 2 ships were the only sizable ships remaining afloat in the harbor. On the way out, We set a 44-foot patrol boat afire and it blew up as a result of strafing. The carrier planes left devastation behind them. Details of times and targets aside, the SBD squadrons of the other carriers paralleled the experience of VB-10. Americans flew a total of 1,250 sorties against targets in the atoll, unloading almost 500 tons of ordnance. An estimated 75% of the supplies at the base, including about 17,000 tons of fuel, went up in flames. The Japanese lost the light cruiser Naka, the destroyers Fumizuki, Oite, and Tachikaze, and the submarine tenders Rio de Janeiro Maru and Haiyan Maru, 3 sub-chasers, a motor torpedo boat, 16 Navy cargo ships, 3 transports belonging to the Army, a merchant freighter, 3 auxiliaries, and 5 tankers to the carrier planes. In addition, 2 more destroyers, a pair of submarines, a transport, a repair ship, and a seaplane tender were badly damaged. The heavy guns of the surface escorts added the light cruiser Katori and the destroyer Mayakaze as they tried to flee the area. Indeed, so many ships were sunk here that to this day the atoll is a kind of sport diver's dream, and expeditions to explore the many shipwrecks and aircraft found on the bottom here are one of the principal drivers of the Micronesian tourist industry. Another light cruiser, the Agano, was caught outside the reef by a submarine in the vicinity of the atoll. The crew of this last ship was terribly unlucky. Hit by a torpedo from an Avenger during the November 1943 Rabaul raid, she was towed to Truk for repairs. On the way, she was torpedoed again by the submarine USS Scamp, but remained afloat. She made Truk and was made seaworthy. On the day before Mitcher's carriers launched their raid, the cruiser departed for Japan in more permanent repair. This timing could have saved her, but not long after getting underway, she was struck again by 2 torpedoes this time, fired by the lurking submarine USS Skate. This last blow finally wrecked the Agano, which nonetheless remained afloat until the next morning. Destroyer Oite came to her aid and took off 523 survivors. The destroyer then returned to Truk, just in time for the carrier planes to arrive and sink her. All but 22 of the destroyer's crew and the Agano survivors went down with her. These losses were inflicted for the cost of 40 American lives, including 11 killed aboard the Intrepid. 25 planes were lost, although some of their crews were rescued, mostly by submarines. 1 Hellcat pilot from the Essex was retrieved inside the lagoon itself under fire by a Kingfisher catapult seaplane launched from the cruiser Baltimore. The task force would return to hit the atoll again at the end of April, after the reckless persecution operations against New Guinea. Another 2-day assault was planned for the 29th and 30th. By that time, the base had already been more or less abandoned by the Navy as a fleet base. Few ships were found there, and although some fighters had been flown in since Hailstone, these were decimated in the opening fighter sweep of this next Mitcher treatment. In the absence of ship targets, the carrier planes struck facilities ashore. Though the Japanese defense had been considerably degraded since February, the mission was by no means safe. Radioman Cawley describes the experience of the first day of this follow-up strike thus, quote, Mr. Ramage, my pilot, was scheduled to lead the third strike. As normal before an attack, we all prepared to test our machine guns by firing 2 or 3 rounds from each. I aimed the guns into a clear area, released the safety, and fired. Each gun fired a couple of rounds when there was an extra loud whack, and I stopped firing. I felt as though someone had hit me across the front of my thighs as hard as you could swing a baseball bat. I cut open my flight suit, and there was a hole in my leg about 2 inches deep. It hadn't started to bleed, so I got my first aid kit and filled the wound with sulfa powder and put a bandage over it. I decided to say nothing of my problem, which was caused by the breech exploding. There was little or no shipping around, but there were lots of major installations and full tank farms. The AA was very heavy and the weather was poor and deteriorating. When we landed, I went to sick bay. Later, a young lieutenant junior grade doctor, on reading an x-ray, showed me where the ejector claw from my left machine gun lay against the thigh bone of my left leg. The doctor probed and dug for half an hour, started some heavy bleeding, but couldn't get the object out of my leg. The next morning they said I had 2 chances: leave the metal in my leg, or schedule a full-blown operation to surgically remove it. The latter option would take me off the flight schedule indefinitely, so I chose the former. I still carry the metal chunk and it has not bothered me. Cawley was back in the air within 3 days. On the second day, a weather front moved in and covered the atoll with a thick layer of cloud stretching down to 1,000 feet or 300 meters. Ramage led another strike against Dublin in these conditions, which he recounts, quote, "I led my SBDs in straight and level at our maximum speed of about 180 knots, dropped on these installations. Since the shipping had all been sunk in the previous raids, the AA was concentrated around the remaining obvious targets, and it was intense. Dublin has an 1,100-foot peak, and they were firing straight at us during our run in. We were all holed, but I think Lou Bang's division got the worst of it from our own bomb fragments. The drop altitude was logged at 700 feet. As we passed out of the atoll to the south, we could see numerous aircraft in the water, several within the atoll. There were several SOCs and OS-2Us from the cruisers and battleships on the water rescuing downed airmen. We were fortunate not to have any losses in VB-10. After this strike, Mitchell judged that there was too little of value left to be destroyed on Truk to justify risking further losses, and canceled the remaining strikes. 26 American planes were downed in the April raids, crewed by 46 men, more than half of which were rescued. In addition to the widespread destruction to shore installations, carrier planes claimed another 59 Japanese aircraft shot down, and another 34 wrecked on the ground, leaving no more than a dozen there in flyable condition. This was really the end for Truk as a military asset of the Japanese Empire. Though a large garrison remained there, they were cut off and powerless to do anything other than attempt to avoid starvation. The American fleet left it behind and moved on to prepare for the assault on the Marianas. Truk would be harassed until VJ Day by sporadic bombing raids, and in the last weeks of the war would serve as a practice target for the B-29 units tasked with delivering the atomic bombs. But the Japanese fleet would never return to the Gibraltar or the Pacific. And so that is where I think I will end this episode. Hope you found some of what I had to say here interesting or useful, and I hope you'll be back for the next part of the series, where we'll back up a little in time and take a look at the beginnings of the drive through the Central Pacific. Till then, I want to thank you for listening, and an especially big thanks to those who gave to my Patreon. It really helps me out. Till next time, then, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.